Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 719th New Social Environment and the first New Social Environment of 2023. We're wishing you all a very happy 2023 and New Year. I'm Chloe, the Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Alison de Lima Greene and Kelly Baum. We're thrilled to welcome poet Simon Schuchat here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land that we're speaking from. And now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce today's guest and host. Alison de Lima Greene is the Isabel Brown Wilson Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. A 2010 fellow at the Center for Curatorial Leadership, she has organized numerous exhibitions, and her recent projects have profiled Mark Rothko, Mike and Doug Starn, and Pipilotti Rist. Working closely with Harry Cooper, Kate Nesin, and Mark Godfrey, she co-curated Philip Guston Now, the subject of today's conversation. And our host for today is Cynthia Hazen Polsky and Leon Polsky, Curator of Contemporary Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art Kelly Baum, who has been a curator for over 2 decades at civic and university art museums. Kelly has published widely and organized dozens of exhibitions, and it's my pleasure to pass it over to Kelly now.
Thank you, Chloe. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm very excited to be here with Alison, who I've known for over 20 years. We actually worked together for 2 years between 2000 and 2002 at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. I've also been trailing the exceptional retrospective that she co-curated around the country. I've been lucky enough to see it in both Boston and Houston. And anyway, just delighted to be here and to be in conversation with Alison about Philip Guston. So I thought we'd begin, Alison, by talking about your own experience with Guston, how you came to know his work, when you first met him. I experienced Philip Guston Now in Houston. I experienced it as a kind of dialogue, very much a dialogue with the artist. It seemed to me that it reflected a longstanding engagement with his work, and it was possessed of a degree of intimacy and comfort that really stood out to me. And I know that you have a long history with the artist, and so I thought you could begin by giving us a little bit of the backstory.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And yes, I had the unique privilege of actually visiting Guston in his studio in 1974. My father had been one of his students at the University of Iowa, and they maintained a warm friendship after that. And so imagine being 17 years old, about to enter college, and you walk into Philip Guston's studio and he brings out the Nesin drawings, he brings out the Klan paintings, as well as earlier works, and my mind simply exploded.
Mm-hmm.
He was very, very kind to me. I would go to every opening subsequently at David McKee Gallery, as rolled out one amazing series after another. Had a chance to then write about him and help add his work to the collection here at the Museum of Fine Arts. We were very lucky to borrow an amazing group of works a number of years ago from the Edward R. Broida collection. And so when this opportunity came to mount the exhibition in Houston, of course we jumped on it. But I also should say that Gary Tintereau, our director, was unstinting in his support of this.
Excellent. Well, Alison put together a fantastic PowerPoint that we're going to walk through, and we'll use slides in the PowerPoint to cue our conversation. And Chloe, do you mind advancing to, let's see, let's stop here. So periodically, Alison and I will pause on individual works of art that will parse in greater depth, and we'll also use them as springboards to discussions about key moments in the evolution of Guston's career. And this was our first rest stop, in a way, mother and child, from 1930, which is, as you see here in the credit line, a promise gift to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, to which Music Guston Mayer has promised 220 extraordinary works by Guston, including this phenomenal early painting. And so in 1930, Guston is still very young. He was born in 1913, so he's still a teenager. By this point, I believe he had met Jackson Pollock, spent a few months at Otis, and he, but for the most part, he was self-taught, and he's absorbing a wide range of art historical traditions, mostly through print. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this work, Alison.
Thanks so much, Kelly. One of the decisions we made for the presentation in Houston was to follow a chronological unveiling of Guston's life, because there's so many deep references as he minds his own career. And thanks to the incredible work first done by Dory Ashton and then subsequently by Musa Mayer, the artist's daughter, we understand the biographical dimensions of many of these paintings. And this mother and child, of course, reflects a panoply of sources. We can point to Michelangelo, we can point to the work of Picasso in the 1920s, most clearly to Curator. What I find poignant in this painting, created when Guston was roughly 17, the exact date of manufacture isn't here, is that as a young man at age 10, or as a child really, at age 10, he found his father dead of suicide. And the powerful image of the mother as this protector and all-enveloping, loving figure, I think has that kind of emotional urgency. That is one of the reasons why we continue again and again to find Guston so important, because that urgency, that immediacy, that sense of now, reflected in our choice of title, continues to resonate, even though this painting was almost a century old, which I almost impossible to wrap my mind around.
Now, Guston was an artist who had an extraordinary insight into the human condition, and it's definitely visible here. Chloe, could you advance?
One
Here's
of the
some.
things, we did with the show is, try both in the catalog and in the didactics in the exhibition to really, parse the early work. For example, I was very excited to be able to reproduce this Lorser Feidelson, which is in such interesting dialogue with Guston, nude philosopher in space-time, a painting that is not well known. And so the other thing that I think is the privilege of doing an exhibition like this is the ability to sort of, if you will, explore the crevices of an artist's language as it is evolving. And I found it particularly interesting that both Guston and Feidelson use this light bulb as an illumination. Of course, the Feidelson's only illustrated in the catalog. We don't have it on the wall.
I think that the early work by Guston, the work from the 1930s and 1940s, which is probably lesser known, is ripe for more investigation and study. That definitely applies to Guston's murals from the mid to late 1930s and very early 1940s. And I wanted to stop here for a few moments to begin a discussion around those murals, but also to talk about Guston's engagement with the Mexican muralists. He met Orozco and Siqueiros, in Los Angeles and eventually traveled to Mexico to collaborate on a mural called The Struggle Against Terrorism. You see it here. And I think that you recently hosted a conversation around Guston's murals in Houston, focusing on this one in particular.
Yes, Mike Wellen put together a wonderful panel, and we were joined by a learner who was came here from California. And certainly Guston's indebtedness to particularly the work of Orozco and Siqueiros is evident in this painting. What is lost in this reproduction, it's the clearest reproduction of the work in its entirety. But in black and white, we've lost the incredible palette that Guston brought to this painting along with Kadish and Jules Langsner, his collaborators. It is a very sort of not just Renaissance palette, but closer to the pastels of Piero della Francesca, he loved, of course. We have this reproduction on view in the exhibition, much as Boston did, to establish his early use of clan imagery, which you can see in this zoom in detail, where the hooded figures are not simply clansmen, the figures that haunted Guston from early days. He had seen Klan rallies in Los Angeles as a young man, but once transported to Mexico, this was created in Morelia, takes on added dimension of universal evil, whether it's clansmen, whether it's representation of the Inquisition, or I think most tellingly, the figure being coupled with the swastika, which you glimpse on the far right margin, is a testament to the artist's immediate response to the rise of Nazi Germany following the election of Hitler as chancellor in 1953.
No, this is a very clear indication of his early concern with terrorism, with prejudice and violence. And I think it also speaks to his melding of personal and global tragedy and trauma, which are themes that reoccur and which we'll return to later in our discussion. Chloe, could you please?
Yeah, just one last comment. And you can see that influence continuing in the bombardment. But what I also think is important is that Guston and his colleagues went to Mexico and begged for the opportunity of major commission for granted, which is, I think, a wonderful cross-national movement as well.
Chloe, could you advance? And these are some installation views of the first gallery and the retrospective in Houston. And we'll pause here for a moment to continue talking about Guston's early murals. In 1935, he joins the Federal Art Project of the Works Progress Administration, and eventually he would join the mural division. By 1936, he's in New York City. He's applying for commissions, not all of which he receives, but some of which he does receive. And he ends up making murals in New York, Georgia, New Hampshire, and elsewhere. Some don't survive. And you, Alison, had wanted to stop here at this study for the Queensbridge Housing Project mural, which he finished in 1939.
And the study, I think, is very interesting compared to the final version. And I wanted to mention that while Guston's murals made in the United States, I think, supported him, expanded his career. He did important work in this manner, but it didn't allow him the full moral compass he wanted to express in his work. When you see this study, you see that he's looking at the desperate lives of workers who had been abandoned, if you will, by the Depression, job opportunities. As you might imagine, the Queensbridge Housing Project did not want an open coffin in its community center. They want sorrowing out of work laborers. Finally, the image on the left is translated into a very happy family. The image on the right is happily engaged industrial workers. But it's interesting that the battling children holding up what becomes one of God's signature images, the shield of a garbage can lid, does survive in a number of paintings from this era, both in the mural and related canvases. Finally, it's the canvases rather than the murals that allow Guston to express his deepest feelings.
I think, and Chloe, could you go back one, the murals are so important. You're right, the studies definitely give you insight into his aspirations that the finished works do not. There's the figure in the center of this one is really, truly horrific, almost a creature more so than a human. And the study as a whole speaks to Guston's commitment to truth-telling. And I see them though, even as he moves away from murals into easel painting, there's an interest in the public, in speaking to the public about matters that matter to the public. And I wonder if, and for me, there is a thread that connects this study in particular with works like The Tormentors, and even some of the paintings from the late 60s and early 1970s, where he's mining issues and events and phenomena that are relevant to the public, the kind of open source of public life, and speaking openly to a public.
And one last observation while we're on this work. One of the things that struck me powerfully when we were discussing the murals a couple of weeks ago was this line of red bricks that runs off the space and establishes a very essentially shallow space. And Guston's work at this period is not often discussed in formal terms, but the shallow space continues to be something Guston returns to again and again, as does the red wall. And so we're also seeing him establishing a formal language that he continues to enrich. I think, again, another thread that I wish I'd investigated sooner. I think we can go to the next slide.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so more images, installation shots, Sunday interior from 1941. And we'll pause here on an image of If This Be Not I from 1945. This is an allegorical, deeply distressing work that was painted the same year, painted while Guston was living in St. Louis, teaching there, and finished the same year that the concentration camps, the Nazi concentration camps, were liberated. And Guston would have seen in St. Louis an exhibition of photographs of those camps. And you and I have talked in some of our prep discussions about this work in relationship to themes around blindness, masquerade, but also personal and global trauma. And so I'm curious to hear you open up a little bit about this one.
So this is something I wrote about in the catalog, but of course now wish I could rewrite my essay because I recognized many of the themes, and of course at the very core of this painting, the young child facing the viewer is Musa, his daughter, and we have a wonderful snapshot of Musa standing next to this Houston. But I think it's very important to notice that Guston is constantly masquerading in all the early works. The number of times that you see hooded figures, whether directly referring to Klansmen or just more performative figures, such as the jesters we see in some of his murals and mural sketches. But here I think the masking and blindness has a very poignant reference. If we just go one more slide forward. The little girl in Helen Levitt's famous photograph holding up a mask I think must be the source
Mhm.
for the
Yeah.
child masking on the detail on the left. But what I think now is important to acknowledge was why the masking, why the blindness in this particular painting being so pointed. And I think Guston must be thinking about how America abandoned Jews and other refugees seeking asylum from Hitler's Europe. If this be not I, well, of course, there's been much research how this is taken from a child's poem, but for Guston, whose family emigrated from the very heart of Europe, became the bloodlands of World War II, the consciousness of had his family not emigrated would have been acute. And I think the willful blindness in these children is his expression of outrage.
Chloe, could you go back one slide so we have the full painting, and just to indicate for members of the audience is that part of what you're seeing in this painting and related works from around the same time are sort of children playing at mock warfare, mock battle, and there's a degree of performativity and theatricality here, which is also, which is joined by the very real specter of violence, and it's interesting that he projects this violence onto the bodies of children. It feels almost like a distancing technique, maybe, desire to make the trauma feel less acute, but then the very fact that it is projected onto children makes it all the more terrifying. And I see it, we're about to go to a slide that represents some of his abstractions, but in a work like this one, I begin to see compositional similarities between the so-called representational work and the more abstract work from the 1950s.
And we begin to get this very interesting transition following If This Be Not I. We have a, not in the show, but illustrated in the catalog, one of the preliminary compositions that preceded this key painting. And you can see that Guston is very quickly going through a period of experimentation, realizing after being very much acclaimed for his narrative paintings that kind of figuration is not the most current language of the American avant-garde. And I think it's very interesting that Somersault, it's very clear that the musicians are African-American, something known from the informal jazz clubs of St. Louis. But in Porch, they become musicians, most likely the kind who witnessed the executions in the death camps. One of the forms of Nazi terrorism was to find musicians among their prisoners who would perform or under the threat of death. And I think Guston, he's also considering how an artist is a privileged witness. In a way, your life is saved by your artistic talent in the grim scenario, but also at what great emotional cost.
I'm struck by the hands in the porch, which cover so many of the raised hands, which cover faces and necks. I mean, these are figures that seem to be embracing themselves or protecting themselves, perhaps against threat of some kind.
One of the things, and we can go to the next slide, that I was very grateful to our colleagues, next slide please, in Boston for making clear was shortly after he was wrapping up this series of paintings, you will see the specter of the Klansman reoccurring in Guston's work. And I had known the article in Life magazine from 1946 for many years. I'd gotten it through interlibrary loan though, so I'd only seen the article itself. I didn't know the whole magazine. And in Boston, they had a display case that made clear that in the exact same issue as the profile of Guston, an enormous privilege and national recognition, was a 3-page article on the resurgence of the Klan. And I can only imagine Guston's dismay on going out to buy Life, and then to find that before the page is dedicated to him, this is horrific resurgence of Klan demonstrations. And I don't think it's the only reason why the paintings that you see in the studio view were all destroyed by Guston, but I do think he felt this current in his work was inadequate, and he was trying to find a new pictorial language.
Alison, what is the perspective on the Klan in that article in Life magazine? Does it take a sort of neutral tone, or is it more critical?
It's neutral, not critical, and I think it's a report on a rally at Stone Mountain, and it's slightly sensational.
Yeah.
And its pledges initiate in a mystic pageant on Georgia's state mountain, Stone Mountain. I mean, that kind of headline is a shocker.
Yeah. It's terrifying.
It's not mystic, it's evil.
Yeah.
And
No, you can
would have felt that
imagine.
strongly.
And then here we are, 1947-48. He's approaching abstraction, and yet there are hoods in this work, and in the related drawing. So he's beginning to reintroduce imagery from the 1930s, but also obscure and disguise it at the same time.
And I don't think the drawing was shown until many, many, many years later. The Tormentor's painting entered the canon. And it's a good moment to sort of mention that Guston was an incredibly harsh critic on his own self. I mean, he described many paintings and edited these early years very carefully when presenting himself in his first retrospectives.
Chloe, can you advance, please? So now we're entering the period of the late 1940s and early 1950s, and Guston's career, his practice undergoes an enormous shift. He takes a leave of absence from university in Washington, moves to Italy for a year, and by 1950 he creates his very first true abstraction, and we're looking at one early abstraction from 1954. And a drawing, one of the few drawings that survive from his year in Rome, Untitled Ischia. Can you advance, Chloe? Oh, did you want to say something, Alison?
Before we leave the previous slide, these paintings won him a completely new audience. And of course, the critical response was very enthusiastic. There were terms thrown around like abstract impressionist, however, that Guston really did not like. And keep this in mind as we go to the next slide, which you can put up now. Advance, please. One more slide. And how restless his approach is, that he could have pretty much stopped at this point in his career and, kept making the same painting over and over again to the delight of dealers like Sidney Janis, who are now representing him. Ellie, I think you wanted to take a deeper dive at this.
Yes, I was, and I am reminded of something that a Guston quote from must be the 1970s after the exhibition at Marlborough, but the same artist who made these paintings would eventually say something along the lines of, "Every time I see an abstraction, I now smell a mink coat," and so, which is one of many repeatable comments by Guston. So yes, we talked about pausing here for a moment, and just to let everyone know, we're looking at from left to right, Passage from 57-58, which is in your collection, Alison,
Yes.
Fable from 56-57, and Painter from 1959. And these were just the sorts of works and that were shown at Sydney Janis, and some of them might actually have been in Janis exhibitions. And what I find interesting about these, in particular the abstractions from the later 1950s, is just how difficult they are. They're not easy paintings. They're not beautiful paintings. There's an edge to them. It's almost as if they want to be unliked. And so I was sort of pondering the slide and looking at the individual images, and what is it that we see here? Based on the titles alone, there's a clear interest in allegory and storytelling. That's the title, Fable. There's also a kind of interest in self-consciously, reflexively investigating the act of painting itself. One is called, one of the works, the work at the far right is called Painter. And actually there would be several subsequent abstract paintings of titled Painter. Guston, of course, was very invested in the process of making art, and he talks about process often in interviews. I think about the painting in the middle, and that's Fable. Its composition reminds me so much of If This Be Not I, where the forms are kind of clustered in a chaotic mass in the center of the canvas. There is a kind of shallow depth to the paintings that's also accompanied by kind of depthlessness. It's interesting that he tends to, insofar as he clusters forms in the center of the canvas, he creates a kind of natural frame around the composition. So a frame within the confines of the painted composition. Of course, this palette, we recognize the palette. It has occurred. It will occur again in later works. And finally, I was just struck by Harry Cooper's really, brilliant analysis of these paintings in the catalog. And he says that he sees in these paintings a kind of longing on Guston's part for things, for solidity and also for things. And thus maybe the title, The Painter, and variations on that same title. In those paintings, the forms would become ever more discrete and emphatic. And you see related works to the right.
Before you jump forward, can we go back to one more thing? One of the other things that you can only tell in an exhibition works or seeing them in person is, I discovered when we were lighting this gallery that Fable was really hard to light. That unlike the paintings on either side that had a very matte surface, the Fable was very oil rich, and light kept bouncing off the painting. So I was working with our lighting crew, and suddenly we realized, wait, it's on purpose. Oil rich. He wants the reflective surface.
Yeah.
And so he's testing every aspect of composition, not just how he's arranging forms or the palette, but he's really conscious, I think, for the first time of the range of possibility in paint itself, and how the paint itself can be modified to be differently, have a different presence in the gallery.
Yeah, and that's so evident here, and it leads to this really luscious materiality in these works and in subsequent works. Chloe, can you advance to the next slide?
And then, of course, we get the alpha and omega.
I know.
Transitional period.
1967, yeah.
And Kate writes particularly well in the catalog about Guston's treatment of line. And in the ink drawings that are largely non-objective, there's still this sort of temptation to even think, can that be on a line? Is it truly a pure drawing? Or in the charcoal drawings that immediately followed, where, you know, if you just saw the right half of the charcoal drawing, you could say, oh, that's another abstraction. Title and the book completely anchor it. And I think yet another, you know, essay could be written about Guston's choice of media, the fluidity of the ink of the pure abstractions to the return to imagery and the spikiness, the drawings that come through. And of course, this is the moment when Guston's wrestling with how to face the brutality of the world. 67, 68 are the years of enormous unrest in the United States. And we get to the big reveal of the next room, where he vents his feelings about what he calls the brutality of the world, a time when it's no longer adequate to go to the studio to adjust a red to a blue.
Could you advance, Chloe? And I think we have a close-up of Drawing for Conspirators, don't we? Yes.
Yeah. And thanks to Gary Tintereau, who is a very good respondent to the layout of the show, we drew this drawing further into the exhibition rather than putting it side by side chronologically with the mother and child, although the two are contemporaneous, because I think it helped us sort of unpack the later Klan imagery. And just one slide further forward, next slide, yeah, there for a minute, and emphasizing that Guston's experience of the Klan as a child was a lived experience, that the Klan was a very, you know, it wasn't just targeting the African-American community, although African-American community was their primary and most violently acted against victims, but they were anti-union, they were anti-immigration, saw Klan violence as did Asians, and the sort of, you know, banality of this sort of, you know, Klan car driving around Anaheim, California. You probably saw something similar in Los Angeles. Even the car is wearing a hood. And this, I think, helps us understand what happens next. Can we go to the next slide, please? When Guston says he's dreaming about living in a city taken over by evil, taken over by the Klan, it is lived memory. As he's going back to the experience of his childhood, he's also drawing on the influence of the cartoonists he loved best, particularly Mutt and Jeff and Crazy Cat. There's that red wall again.
Exactly. No, he's painting a lot of walls at this time.
Yeah.
I know. Well, we wanted to spend a few minutes at least, or maybe a minute or two. I see we are already at 1:40, but discussing this installation, this really powerful installation at the venue in Houston, and also diving into these works specifically. In the center, we see the studio from 1969, and it's surrounded by a wide range of object paintings from the same period. And of course, the studio represents, it's a self-portrait, essentially, a self-portrait of the artist as a Klansman painting a self-portrait of himself as a Klansman, and it's deeply self-reflexive. It's very contradictory, difficult painting, and anyway, I know that this you write about this brilliantly in the show. I really appreciated the way, in general, you contextualize his representation of hooded figures historically. I think it added a lot to the narrative around the work.
And I really felt that there was a way of conveying just in this installation, this sort of racing thoughts that occupy an artist or a writer or any creative person while in the process of working.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to give a shout out to my Boston colleagues, although they placed the studio in a different context. The loose arrangement of the smaller paintings is definitely stolen from their art installation.
Mm-hmm. Can we advance to the next slide? Here we are. We're looking now at Blackboard, and we thought we would take a moment just to use this particular image to drive home the point that Guston's, despite the quote I cited earlier, Guston said that every time he looked at an abstraction, he smelt a mink coat. He was deeply invested in abstraction. It's clear from a painting like the Blackboard from 1969, that he never gave up his roots as an abstract painter. And actually for him, the dichotomy of abstraction and representation was a false one. Could we go forward to the next one?
Oh, actually, I want to hold on.
Oh, did you want to talk about erasure here? Okay.
Yeah, the erasure, I think. Just the fact that, of course, the Blackboard was erased.
Yes.
And you can tell there's so many moments in this painting that he has taken out. And erasure becomes more and more important thereafter. We can go next.
Yeah.
As Guston basically ushers the Klansmen out of the studio.
And this is 1973-74 when he begins to abandon that imagery. And you see there's an untitled self-portrait on the right that that's been painted over a hooded figure. And then you see another hooded figure that's gradually disappearing. And I think about these works. Here he's very literally erasing, covering, but this formal technique, it resonates politically and personally. I also, Guston's work is so deeply recursive anyway. He seems to always frequently be returning to earlier motifs, earlier kind of languages, earlier iconography. And so there is always, even if a palimpsest isn't visible in a painting, or you come to learn that there are invisible palimpsests in his work, that a painting from 1969 has embedded in its DNA paintings from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Could you go forward, Chloe?
And then, of course, Guston becomes his own protagonist.
Yes.
And we can go to the next painting. And I love the fact that the title is Painting, Smoking, Eating. So we see this smoking, we see the evidence of eating with the French fries on his belly. But everything that had been erasing thought, the smaller paintings now is crammed in here.
Consuming him.
Guston is introducing himself, an artist who almost never did self-portraits. There are only a handful in the first decades of his career, now becomes the chief protagonist along with Musa, his wife, the late paintings. And that light bulb, please hold, go back, becomes such a poignant image. Again, referring to the early work, and that shade pull suggests that the scene may be taken away. And this is when Guston's own health is beginning to fail. And he talks in his studio notes about how it's himself, it's Musa, it's love that is the subject that he's turning his attention to.
And do you think it's his confrontation with mortality, his mortality, Musa's mortality, that prompts him to paint so many deeply personal pictures, or are there other reasons as well?
I think there are many reasons. I think, Guston, thought deeply. I think he is, taking measure of a life. That paintings, the Klan paintings, when they were shown at Marlborough Gallery, turned into one of the more ridiculous episodes in critical writing. Most journalists responding to the show. And so I think he felt that time was limited.
Yeah.
He had to make the work that was most meaningful. And also, I think, rather than trying to talk about political symbols, realizing that his own life lived was a social engagement, was survival. And he's now pretty much withdrawn to New York from his letters say how much he hates being in the city. He does go up to Boston to teach once. But there's, I think, so much happening at once with these works that there's no single explanation.
Chloe, could you advance, please? Seen some more installation photographs. These are among some of my favorite paintings by Guston, the jumbled legs and the part objects, body parts. I just find them so so strange and compelling at the same time. Alison, you wanted to spend some time with Legend.
Yeah,
and
I've
it's very
had the
special
good,
to you. Yeah,
I have the good fortune to have spent some time with it because I helped usher it into this museum's collection, thanks to the support of Peter Marzio and our board of trustees back in the 1980s. And I sought this painting out for the collection because it seemed to be such an anthology of Guston's concerns, going back to images that started from his, mural studies, the shield held up in protection, the arm reaching from the top, referring to the fist of Officer Pup from his beloved George Harriman comics. The horse, you could loosely see it as a literal nightmare, but I think more specifically refers to Isaac Babel's Riding with the Red Cavalry stories, which Guston loved. And then I particularly appreciated Lisa Mayer pointing out that she certainly remembered the Hudson Bay blanket that Guston is lying under. He often worked all night in the studio and would nap during the day under this blanket. And the very poignant detail, Guston had a comb over, which when sleeping would come unraveled. And I think this sort of allowing us to see the artist in this dream state, these racing thoughts, again, compressed into the painting, showing us himself vulnerable, showing himself also the sort of agent of all this imagery. It's unforgettable.
Yeah, I know. Is this I don't know that I've seen another painting with an animal, with a horse in it before.
There is one other variation with a horse with the reference to Isaac Babel, although and then there's a dog painting that's pretty well known. But yeah, Guston typically focused on figures and objects, not the animal kingdom. I think there's sketches that we can see.
Chloe, could you, there we go.
And one of the things we added to Houston was a number of lithographs, and I'm very grateful to Edward Broida for giving us half the portfolio that Guston created in his last year of his life in 1980. The great collaboration he had with Gemini Zhao, and Musa Mayer is also donating the rest of this portfolio to Houston, which I am unspeakably grateful for. Last room, our exit to the show. And of course, Guston talking is the painting that I don't think any of us can ever forget once having seen it. This sort of north, south, east, west axis of the composition, the clock painting forward, the watch painting pointing backwards, the cigarettes that were killing him, creating this downward spiral of and yet the artist is so present. And that immediacy is just, you know, what we take away.
I'm also really struck by this painting's black background and the presence of that string, you know, the string that's attached to bulbs, and you know, it the beaded string, you imagine it attached to a bulb, you associate bulbs with illumination, and yet the background is so dead and stark, and the backgrounds of the paintings would begin to get dark like this in the late 1970s.
It reminds me also of the, you know, Goya's black paintings. Harry Cooper brought to our attention. And I think if anyone has not had a chance to see the Michael Blackwood film, I know Brooklyn Rail hosted a screening recently. Seek it out. The presence of Guston in conversation is so great. And one of my favorite moments, and I wish he could walk through this installation, but there's a great moment when he's walking through the San Francisco retrospective with Henry Hopkins, and he walks up to one of his paintings hanging on the museum walls, and he pats it. And he said, "I've always wanted to do that when I'm in the museum." So anyway, I think we wanted to give time to some of the respondents. And I think Chloe is going to help steer some of the comments. You know, many comments, almost 100 have come in. And
oh, that's right.
So Chloe, perhaps you could share some of the conversations and questions.
Thank you so much, Alison and Kelly. That was a really thorough and generous discussion about the exhibition and Guston's work. I'm really thankful to both of you for this conversation today. We have had so many comments over the course of your conversation. Someone just recently asked for the name of the film one more time. It's called Conversations with Philip Guston, and it's produced by Michael Blackwood Productions, directed by Michael Blackwood. I am going to allow our first question, which is going to come from Isabella Karen Sherrards in the audience. Isabella, I am going to give you the chance to ask directly if you'd like. You're able to unmute now. Otherwise, I can ask your question as well.
Would you ask it, please?
Yes, I will ask it.
Thank you so much.
Isabella's question is, how does Purim fit into the If Not I discussion of Philip Guston's work?
Gosh, I think I need some research time to come back to it. Of course, the Feast of Purim is about children. And one of the things that I'm not sure I can answer that question specifically, but I do think it opens up the conversation to allow us to talk about Jewishness and Guston. He was Jewish. The fact that he cast off the name Goldstein to assume the name Guston was a source of guilt in later years. Although, of course, many people, including my father, Stephen Green, who was also born Goldstein, took a similar path. And I think certainly during the Holocaust and its horrific aftermath, as it came to be known, Guston wanted to insist on these traditions.
Thank you so much for that answer, Alison, and thank you for that question, Isabella. The next question is going to be from GE. GE, I'll allow you to unmute.
Thank you so much, and Happy New Year to everyone. My question is, did despair and anxiety allow Guston to change kind of the rules of the game and motivating that desire to play in comically serious ways as kind of an antidote to religious, political, and dogmatic rhetoric of his time? And of course, that's a lesson for our times?
Well, of course, humor is a powerful weapon, and it has a strong tradition in Jewish culture as well. How to disarm your enemy is through satire is a possibility, although you couldn't say that Guston or Jewish people have sole license to that. You can look at Goya, for example, or others before him. But I think certainly there are so many, tools in Guston's, box. I don't think any one of these is the sole reason for, understanding his work. I think they all come together in a more complex meaning. But Kelly, perhaps you'd like to add to that?
That's a great question. I was just going to add that humor is one way to disarm and deflate and embarrass your enemy. It is a great tool, and there's a long tradition of radical satire in art history. It's a weapon that's been used by activists and also by artists. And so I see it in Guston's hands as a way not to make what's difficult easier, but to poke fun and deflate what he's, the horrible things and people that he's representing.
Thank you very, very much, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question, GE, and thank you for those answers, Kelly and Alison. The next question is going to be from Ariel in the audience. Ariel, I will allow you to unmute.
Hello, I'm trying to look for my question in the chat. I said, why isn't the Klan's targeting of Jews as well as the Jewish civil rights workers isn't more discussed thoroughly with Guston's use of Klansmen? And what I mean by that is that sometimes I see, I'm from Mississippi and I'm Jewish. And so there was a disproportionate amount of civil rights activists who were Jewish that came down to places like Mississippi. And I just feel like sometimes that story isn't discussed as much. Also, like with the Dana Schutz incident, it really barely got mentioned at all. And I'm just wondering, also, I was reading the wall text for the MFA Boston, and it refers to Guston's parents being Jewish, but not himself. And I'm just wondering if that was deliberate or just phrasing.
Well, I think part of that is that Guston was not an observant Jew. And so it is, I think a slightly, I think they wanted to be very careful about, that phraseology. But I would like to recommend to you a fantastic article that came out, and it's fairly easy to find on the internet, and published in Jewish Currents by in response to the Boston show by Zoe Samudzi, and Samudzi on Guston Under the Hood, and her discussion of that aspect of Guston's career, I think, is very pertinent to your question. And in Houston, we took a slightly different approach to the didactics. I actually took the liberty of reaching out to many people in our community, including the Holocaust Museum, as well as our traditionally Black universities, to reconsider how we wanted to frame Guston for an audience that grew up in a Jim Crow South. And so we took a significantly different tact in our didactics than Boston did. One thing you might enjoy also is if you go to the MFAH website, all the audio stops are available there for our exhibition.
Thank you so much, Ariel, and thank you for those answers, Alison and Kelly, yet again. The next question is going to be from Joanne in the audience. Joanne, I will give you the opportunity to ask yourself, or I can ask on your behalf. I will go ahead and ask on Joanne's behalf. The question is, or Joanne, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please feel.
Okay. I'm not an expert on this, and partly that's why I'm asking. I was wondering if either of you who are experts on Guston or anybody else who's part of the Zoom knew about Rome at the point that he was living there. What did you say, for a year or for a short period? Yeah.
I talked to that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Guston actually went to Rome on a number of occasions. The first time was in 48, 49, when he had opportunity to spend a year at the American Academy in Rome. And it was a transitional moment for him. He brought back no canvases from that tenure. And he actually left Musa, his wife, and little Musa, or Inga as the family called her, in America during that tenure. But he went back to Rome on a number of occasions. I think Italy, from his early love with Piero della Francesca to his experiences there, remained a lodestar. He went there again in the mid-60s after his Jewish Museum exhibition. He had a very important period in Rome in sort of recovery from the Marlborough show in the after 1970. And there was a great show that Hauser and Wirth mounted, I believe it was in the Los Angeles Gallery, with a wonderful catalog by Musa Mayer that focused on that period in Guston's career and the larger meaning of Italy in a funny way. And Kelly may want to expand on this further, but I think Guston, who had loved Piero, had loved Michelangelo and so many other artists, Uccello, in reproduction as a child, and young artists, when he actually got to Italy and saw them in person, it also freed him in a way. He did not need to imitate their compositions any longer. But I think he drew power and strength from what would have been called the old masters, that he felt he stood on their shoulders. And of course,
I was wondering too about contemporary artists, because there was such despair and sadness and a sense of grief in Italy, in addition to the fact that we know the Roman Catholic Church was hiding their culpability of how they were involved in the murder of Jews and so on. There were so many people who were had lost family, had lost everything. One of the first people I met in Italy had lived in two houses that were both burned down by the Germans, one after the war had been won by the Allies. And there was just such a sense of people being devastated. And it seems that that had something to do with the abstraction in Italy, which was more hard-edged, I think. This is just from observation, not from having researched it. But his liminal state between abstraction and representation that one of you said, I thought was really an interesting comment. It's not such a different thing. It felt very familiar to me from some of the Italians who were painting and doing ceramics and sculpture from around the same time. And I was wondering if they were friends, colleagues, if they were seeing each other's works, that kind of thing.
I honestly can't answer that. As much as I would like. Peter Miller, who has organized work exhibitions featuring Guston and has worked at the American Academy, is actually preparing research on exactly that theme. And since Peter has not yet published that, I don't think I can exactly scoop his observations, but keep an eye out, because I think Peter will be sharing his findings on exactly what Guston would have seen in Rome. Rome, of course, was impoverished by the war, but it wasn't the site of the bombings and the destruction that were, say, visible in Sicily or parts of northern Italy.
Thank you so much for that amazing question, Joanne. And thank you for those answers. I am going to open it up to a few more questions before we close the Q&A. The next question I'm going to read on behalf of Sarah Pacino. Can you talk a little bit more about Guston's relationship between erasure and abstraction in general, especially the blackboard in particular? You started on it, but Sarah wants a bit more context.
Kelly, do you want to start?
I know that's such a good question. I mean, I think in some cases, erasure is a form of masking, or so in some cases for Guston, erasure operates as a form of masking. And so there are actual images of masked figures in some of the earlier paintings. And then Guston begins to mask one composition with another in later works. And I think but erasure as it relates to abstraction, I mean, I think erasure is a path to abstraction, but it also, I think erasure becomes a way for him maybe to mediate the relationship between abstraction and representation. And so a recognizable image can become more abstract if it's blurred or erased or hidden or masked. That's how I would begin to answer that question, at least.
And I also think, you know, there's a commonality with other artists that he was close to or admired. Certainly, I was looking at 1950s Rothko over the weekend and thinking about how much Rothko erased. And I think de Kooning is another artist who would reveal.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And so I think those very visible pentimenti and the erasures also, I think, emphasize not only the process of creation, which Guston was interested in, but also basically conveyed the idea that a painting was arrested at a moment. That again, it gets back to that nowness that we've been talking about before in relation to Guston, and makes it all the more immediate.
I think it goes to the unfinishedness of his style. And he talks a lot about the difficulty of, the importance of deciding when a painting is finished, and that's everything. And he says in some interviews that he can sense it coming. He's a day or two away from it being finished, and yet for all that, so many of his finished paintings feel as if they're still in a state of becoming, as if a moment in the process of creation was just stopped, halted, but just temporarily. At the same time, Guston would say, any one painting that he deems finished could never be any other way, because it's like the pieces of a puzzle coming together and fitting perfectly.
Thank you so much for that question, Sarah, and for those rich answers. I am going to ask the next question on behalf of Karen Wilkin in the audience. Would you speak about Guston and Beckman, whose work he obviously adored and whose work he knew well?
Thanks so much, Karen, for that question. I think when Kelly and I were putting together the slideshow, we started off with many more comparisons and realized we had to strip it down. But Beckman was enormously important to Guston. And although the two, I don't know, and Karen perhaps can confirm, I don't know if the two ever became truly acquainted. Guston left WashU in St. Louis right before Beckman arrived. But certainly Guston was looking at Beckman's paintings in person as soon as he got to New York, and was able to see the work in exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art, as well as their collections. And I think Beckman's own strong response to the evil that was happening in Germany established a particular kinship for Guston, and his need to also explore the fantastic. Beckman's own array of performers in many of his paintings. The idea of the fable as a motivating force certainly is found in Beckmann's work as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. The next question is going to be from Michael in the audience. Michael, I'll allow you to unmute now to ask your question directly.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Thank you, Chloe. I would like to first of all say thank you to all involved with this particular presentation. It is remarkable. It makes me think of a link between Leon Golub, Nancy Spiro, obviously Guston, and also more recently Botero in his paintings of the Abu Ghraib period. What I'd like to ask is related to the relationship of the exhibition to it being muted or silenced for a period of time when it was postponed. That, in a sense, is a kind of erasure. And what it brings to the surface for me is when an artist is making a series of works about something, they reveal a certain element of ethics that they have to struggle with. And eventually those ethics get placed out into the popular forum, where the curator also has to deal with not only those particular ethics, but their own particular ethics, the curatorial perspective, which then gets challenged to the beholder. All of that to say very simply, I wonder if you could remark a little bit on your understanding, responsibility of the relationship between the artist and the curator in terms of ethical revelations. And the other observation I would just like to make as a quiet aside is in the last painting that you showed, which is remarkable, talking, the hand on the watch is pointing at Guston, and time is of the essence. Thank you. If you could make some comments.
Thank you, Michael. Of course, you know, there was 2 years ago, you have to remember that 3 out of the 4 museums involved with this exhibition were facing a shutdown. COVID censored us, not the will of any curator or member of the museum administration. And I regret enormously the misunderstandings that came out of perhaps some awkward statements that were made. I don't want to point any fingers at anyone, but that there was, you know, the time when we had to delay the show was also at a terrible time of crisis in the United States. Think of who was the man who was in the presidential seat at that moment. And once we had to put the brakes on the installations to find a way to sort of turn the ship around and find openings again so that all 4 museums could be presenting a contiguous thing was simply a practical matter. It wasn't about muting. It wasn't about censorship. It was when, you know, Houston had a different dynamic because our municipality allowed the museum to reopen quite quickly. In London and DC, the closures were very long and profoundly disruptive. And the same in Boston. And so I think what happened for the curatorial teams was an even greater sense of how we had to honor the artist. And I think each institution is taking a slightly different tact. In Boston, I think a very carefully considered research team took one approach that was more radical. In Houston, we took a more classical one. But there's never a curator who will say, I'm sorry, I have more time to work on a show. We're always feeling like we're rushing towards the opening, like we're roller skating down an icy slope with knives at the bottom of it. And in a funny way, you know, the silver lining of the delay was that we were actually able to take more time to reach deeper into our community, to research further into the work itself and Guston, so that our presentations could be ever deeper. And I know that sounds a little Pollyanna-ish, but particularly after January 6th, and after the terrible things we witnessed over the last few years in Park Houston, which claims George Floyd as one of our own citizens, we had to take very real care about how we thought about presenting the show.
Thank you so much for that question, Michael. Our last question of the day is going to come from Fong H. Bowie.
Thank you. Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Alison. I'm here, believe it or not, at the gallery called Kingfish in Buffalo of Robert Stewart's show. And here's Todd, the owner, and here's Doug Dry Spoon. So I'm just gonna ask a quick question. We know after the Jewish Museum show, we understood readily there were deep affinity relationship to minimalism. Maybe he didn't like minimalism, but he's certainly able to use some of the concept and to his own reduction. You know, Alison, we talk about that beautiful room that you put not in a chronological order, but it was very jazzy the way you stow it. So we knew about that relationship, but what about, I'm thinking about the concept of piling. Do we know any relationship to earth art? Because when I think of Guston, the pie of shoes, even when he painted cherry, the pie of cherry, is there relationship directly or inadvertently of Robert Smithson and other earth artists like Walter de Maria?
Gee, that's a leap I had not ever made in relation to Guston's work. And so I'd have to think about that a lot before I could come back to you on that score. But I actually don't think minimalism was the word or current
Okay.
that he would have thought about. I do think, however, that in poets, and more particularly in his friendship with Mort Feldman and on Cage, there was a kind of austerity that he looked to emulate in his own work, or if not emulating, finding a response to it. The great John Cage quote that Guston liked to repeat, which was, "You have all your influences around you when you enter the studio, and you ask them to leave one by one.
Right.
You're alone."
Yeah.
I think that the term isn't minimalism, perhaps, but kind of existential ground zero that he sought.
Right.
That moment in order to break and refresh his practice.
Do you mind if I jump in, Alison? I think
Sure.
your comparison, Fong, is really interesting. I'm thinking about post-minimal process artists, scatter artists like Barry LeVay, those really kind of, almost gross but fascinating installations by Sarah and Morris, where materials are combined and changed and then dispersed. And also it's true of many of Robert Smithson's projects, but there's an abiding interest in kind of piling, but also in entropy. And I have no idea if Guston was aware of that work. I mean, certainly he was alive, but how closely was he looking at it? But it seems like maybe there's a shared interest in entropy, the kind of loss of energy and the gradual dismantling of order and the descent into chaos. Maybe there's a shared spirit there. That's really fascinating to think about.
Well, I didn't think of it until I came across the lately Curator when everybody was so dismissive of, the pile of gladiators in a claustrophobic space, interior space somewhere, but in the context of how I would say, as much as the impulse to reduce to a reduction, there's also an equally intensity towards the impulse of accumulation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been sort of staying with me for so long. Yeah. But listen, it's a beautiful show. Grazie tante to Alison for done a thoughtful installation and so alive, so moving. And I'm going back next week to see it again, and thank you, Kelly, for coming on, because your Alex new show really rocks. And people are still talking about it. We love when you came on too. So you two are just terrific people. Thank you so much for coming on our NSE and pay this beautiful tribute to Master PG. We call Philip Guston the Master PG. So thank you so much, PG. You guys. Grazie mille. Bye.
Thank you, Fong. Thank you to everyone at the Brooklyn Rail. Generous, not just to this exhibition, but everything about Guston's work you have supported time and again. It feels very, very good to be on this platform today.
Thank you so much, Fong, for that amazing question and for all of your questions today. It's been such a rich Q&A and discussion. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Simon Schuchat, to the stage. Simon Schuchat has lived in New York, Chicago, Shanghai, Tokyo, Beijing, and Moscow, just to name a few. His translations of Chinese and Russian prose and poetry have appeared in various anthologies and magazines, as well as his own poetry, which has been published in 4 collections. According to Kathy Acker, his poetry doesn't tell you stuff, it is consciousness. Soviet texts, his translations of Moscow conceptualist poet Dmitry Prigov, came out in 2020 from Ugly Duckling Press. If you'll please join me in welcoming Simon.
Hello, everyone. I'm particularly pleased to be reading at the tail end of an event on Philip Guston, because Guston was very engaged with poets, and in particular with poets that mattered much to me. And so I remember seeing his drawings as poetry book covers or magazine covers and so on quite early, actually. And I'm also very happy to be reading with the Rail. I have some poems in the current issue of the Rail, both online and in print. The first poem I'm going to read is actually in the print edition. It's called Not by Wyeth. The world is a dangerous place. Unknown dangers everywhere. Known dangers everywhere. Nobody can be trusted until proven trustworthy. Nobody can be proven trustworthy. There are many crazy people. There's a lot of bastards out there. They must be avoided. Walk on the other side of the street. Memory weakens and fades. The sense of smell is gone. Perpetual heartburn, back pain everlasting, nothing tastes good, everything costs too much, nobody is at work anymore, nothing works right, it's all a bunch of lies, it just doesn't make sense. I've already lost 3 inches and gained 5 pounds. The second piece is very short, it's not published anywhere, it's just, I thought of some euphemisms for sex that are kind of relevant today. Knowledge, either carnal or biblical, intercourse, relations, and Congress. The second piece is not either online or in print. It's called What Me Worry. I've gone hiking in the valley of the shadow of death more times and more recently than I would have ever expected. But it's a really amazing valley, full of people you used to know, the landscape so varied, despite any uniformity at the end of the horizon. More than one way to fall off the edge of the world. The views at the summit are memorable, whatever route one took to get there. Not really either race or boxing match, It's a hike, that valley. Some even make it before they're born, and others never seem to set out. And then to end on something a little more upbeat, this poem is called Awoke and Sang, and it's in the online edition of the Rail. The way dreams evaporate in the moment the light enters curtain, those who were there are gone, even recalling who no longer possible. Though sometimes the trace returns, and you remember twilight or elation that someone knew who you were in the absence of any way to reopen the safe once locked. Stacking little boxes inside bigger boxes, creating disorder out of perfection. Art is what makes everything worthwhile, that and small children. Though I've none of my own and have to borrow from relatives. Everyone says we ourselves are but the morning dew, but the babies are not a dream. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was amazing. And thank you again to Alison. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you to the Museum of Fine Arts Houston for their support and preparing for this program. And especially special thank you to Deborah Bricker-Balkin, who couldn't be here today, but who was instrumental in the preparations and planning for this program on Philip Guston's work. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. For 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. And if you're free on Monday at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with Olga Vizot, Susanna V. Temkin, Jose Falcone, and Monica Espinel on the event of Juan Francisco Elso por America at El Museo del Barrio. We'll conclude with a poetry reading by Irene Vasquez. And as is tradition, you can now turn on your microphone and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Tremendous.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you.
Bye.